Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
Tonight, as I say, we have Professor Nigel Copsey from Teesside University as our speaker. He's the Professor of Modern History and the co-director of the Centre for Fascist, Anti-Fascist and Post-Fascist Studies there. He's published extensively on fascist beliefs and the strategies used by extremist groups to win support in the population and at the ballot box. He's Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Comparative Fascist Studies. His books include work on contemporary British fascism, the British National Party and its quest for legitimacy, and he's edited volumes on fascism and anti-fascism in Britain. He's just published a second and revised edition of his book, Anti-Fascism in Britain, which is out in paperback, published by Routledge. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Copsey.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much. First, let me say that I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak to you this evening. I've spoken to groups in a variety of different places and locations, usually lecture theatres and classrooms is what I'm used to, rather than a Costa coffee shop, which is a new one for me. So it should be interesting. Right, so the title of my talk is Preventing Hate, the Far Right and Hate Crime. And the title is deliberately, and as you will see, it is problematic. Regrettably, the subject of hate crime has become ever more topical. Just Thursday last week, in response to the reported rise in hate crime incidents after the EU referendum, a new national hate crime campaign was launched. And recent Home Office figures revealed that the number of racially or religiously aggravated offences had increased by over 40% in the weeks following the Brexit vote. It was also reported that our region, the North East, had seen the highest increase in reported hate crimes in the weeks following Brexit. Local statistics revealed that hate crime incidents had more than doubled. These are statistics provided by local police forces. Reports also suggested that the vast majority of hate crime incidents following the Brexit vote had been targeted or had involved citizens from Eastern European countries, particularly Poles. And we've also seen in the United States as well a surge in hate crime which has followed the election of Donald Trump. So there seems something of a hate crime epidemic at the moment. And we should always bear in mind that a person who experiences a hate crime may well experience not just the physical effects in terms of, say, physical injury, but the emotional distress, such as feelings of powerlessness, anger, sadness, vulnerability, hurt. There are fears for personal, family safety. That may trigger lifestyle changes, and so on and so forth. The one Home Office study recorded that 92% of hate crime victims had been emotionally affected by their experiences. So the overwhelming majority of victims are emotionally affected by this experience. Now, I don't want to belittle the victim here when I say this, but my principal interest lies not with the victim, but with the perpetrator or perpetrators of hate crime. Now, when we think of hate crime offenders, we tend to think of violent crimes committed by extremist perpetrators, people that are driven by hate-fueled ideologies. If you consider the murder of Joe Cox by the right-wing extremist Tommy Mair, for instance, which has been labelled, quote, a Leave EU hate crime, something like that might well spring to mind. But the question I want to ask is, how representative is this? How far is the far right primarily responsible for hate crime? Now, before I say some more about the far right, I want to make some general observations about the nature of hate crime. The first thing is that the definition of hate crime is really quite problematic. In the first place, a person who commits a hate crime does not have to be motivated by hatred for his or her victim, but rather it is the expression of prejudice against the victim's presumed group. Secondly, with hate crime, for the most part, it is the victim who essentially determines whether it is a hate crime or not. So there's an obvious element of subjectivity as well. An actual evidence of hostility is not required for an incident or a crime to be recorded as a hate crime. Now, the criminal justice system in England and Wales defines hate crime as, quote, any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by a hostility or prejudice. There's not one single piece of legislation for hate crime in Britain. It's covered by a series of laws, such as the Crime and Disorder Act, the Criminal Justice Act, the Public Order Act, and so on and so forth. So there's no single piece of legislation for it. There are, however, 5 centrally monitored strands of hate crime, and by centrally monitored, I mean that they are monitored by the police and the Home Office. So what then are these 5 strands? Well, in the first place, we have race or ethnicity. Secondly, we have religion or beliefs. Third, sexual orientation. Fourth, disability. And fifth, transgender identity. Now, when we look at these different strands of the 5 strands, the first, race hate, accounts for the overwhelming majority of hate crimes that are reported to police. And we're talking about in the region of 80%, followed by sexual orientation hate crimes, and then by religious hate crimes. Now, the police have estimated that only about 1 in 4 hate incidents are ever reported to them, which suggests that of the 52,000 hate crimes that were recorded by police in 2015, and this was an increase of about 19% or so on 2014, the real figure could be as high as over 200,000. Okay? So it works out at an average of perhaps 4,000 hate crimes, hate incidents every single week in this country. Now, thousands of people apparently are being affected by it, so is Britain in the grip of a race hate epidemic or hate crime epidemic. Well, these figures sound horrific. That they ain't good, but it's worth bearing in mind that the vast majority of recorded hate crime incidents relate to verbal harassment, to verbal abuse, rather than actual physical violence. So when we look at the figures, under a third or so of reported hate crimes do involve violence, and then just under a third of those actually result in physical injury. Thankfully, deaths resulting from hate crime are very rare. And when you look at the figures as a whole, only about 0.5% of the total adult population are said to be victims of hate crime every year, just 0.5% of the adult population. Okay, so what else do we know? Well, adults in non-white ethnic groups remain far more likely to be victims of racially motivated hate crime than whites. We know that's true. And of religious hate crimes, anti-Muslim hate crime accounts for the majority of it, although anti-Semitism still accounts for a significant proportion of around about 20%. We also know that a very high proportion of hate crime occurs at or near a victim's house. Often it occurs at work, it may well occur at school, it could well occur as a one-off incident in the street, a random event. More often than not, victims of hate crime will suffer repeat victimization. They tend to experience it repeatedly. We also know that hate crime tends to peak following specific hate trigger events. There was a sharp increase, for example, in reported anti-Muslim hate in July 2013 following the Lee Rigby murder. Attacks on Jews were reported to have increased following Israel's military actions in Gaza. We've also seen reports of hate crime, obviously, against East Europeans reportedly increase after the EU referendum vote. So we know there are these kind of spikes. Okay, so what do we know about hate crime offenders? Well, not a great deal, to be honest. Much of the research that has been undertaken tends to focus upon the victim's perceptions and experiences. So it's very much victim-oriented research that's undertaken. What we do know from police records, court records and so on, is that the majority of hate crime offenders in Britain are white, they are male, and they're under 25. That's the, if you like, the demographic in terms of the majority of hate crime offenders. Now, one study found that just under 1/3 of offenders involved in racial hate crime were from an ethnic minority background. So, although hate crimes it seems, or the majority of hate crimes, especially when it comes to racial hate crime, are committed by younger white males, it's not true that hate crimes are only committed by young white men. But this is the demographic that interests me, the white, the male, the under 25. And this kind of tempts us to draw obvious links between this and organised extremist groups. Now, research on this link is very thin. There's very little research that has been done. What research there is points us towards the rather kind of counterintuitive conclusion that most hate crime offenders are actually not formal members of extreme right groups. The more likely offender will be known to the victim, perhaps local youth, neighbour. It will not be, or will generally not be, an organised right-wing extremist. This is why the title of this talk is somewhat problematic. Now, if we take the recent incidents that have taken place following the EU referendum, of 134 separate racist incidents that were reported in the media in the weeks following the EU vote, of 134, just 11 incidents involved the far right. Now, yes, there were several incidents of far-right graffiti, the daubing on property and so on, but for the most part, perpetrators of these incidents were not obviously linked to the extreme right. Nonetheless, their involvement, the involvement of the far right, does remain a cause for concern because it's often associated with the more violent hate crime. For these far-right perpetrators, the motivation for their engagement in hate crime is not so much the violence itself, but about sending messages to the wider community. And it can obviously overlap with terrorism. It seems to be the case, again, research has demonstrated this, that terrorists often commit less serious hate crimes prior to progressing to more serious offending. We should also bear in mind that the activities of hate groups, especially online, through social media, through the internet and so on, may help to fuel wider climates of hate. So their narratives can give so-called license to hate. That is to say, they can legitimize, they can rationalize, and arguably radicalize their audiences. Offenders can be motivated by far-right messages on social media, but what we find is that they're very often out with or outside organized groups. One of the major problems with hate crime and the talk of hate crime spikes is it tends to reinforce the view that hate crime actions are the actions of a few, that hate crime actions are the actions of extremists, of hot-headed, ideologically driven right-wing nutters or thugs, if you like. Now, whilst the far right can play a part, the reality is far more complex. And motivations that give rise to hate crime are many, and they are varied. So, motivations can range from the very opportunistic, the kind of thrill-seeking excitement under the influence of alcohol, can range to things like turf wars, to protecting territory or perceived geographical turf, through to retaliation for, seeking revenge for perceived attacks following a specific trigger event, such as, for example, the murder of Lee Rigby. And this begs the question, and again, going back to the point I was making at the very beginning about how problematic the title of this talk is, it begs the question that when we come to hate crime, are we therefore not looking in the wrong place? When we're looking for hate crime offenders, are we not looking in the wrong place? I would suggest that as a society we really need to hold up a mirror. You take the mainstream media, for example, the tabloids especially, some of the newspapers that condemned the recent rise in hate crime, and are quite vociferous in our condemnation of this, have also been at the forefront of attacks on migrants, on Muslims, and so on. Then we look at the mainstream politicians. In July 2015, David Cameron described people in Calais as a swarm of migrants trying to reach Britain. Then reflect on the poster, that notorious poster unveiled by Nigel Farage as part of the Leave campaign depicting a queue of migrants. So really, what I want to do is maybe just kind of change the focus or the direction of the talk and say, well, what the hate crimes tell us about the culture of British society. There is for sure strong elements of cultural transmission at play here. There is also, it seems, an element of intergenerational transmission of attitudes, often becoming normalised by the established views of older members of a family, older members within a neighbourhood, peer group, community, and so on. But we also shouldn't forget socioeconomic grievances, and I think this has been underplayed in the literature. What we do find, and some evidence has demonstrated, there has been an over-representation amongst offenders of those who are unemployed or economically inactive. Now, for sure, there is a myth in this country of British tolerance. To quote The Spectator, quote, "Britain is the most tolerant country in Europe, perhaps the world. In France, for instance, a national news-making hate incident is the attempted burning down of a mosque, which happened last month in Toulouse. In Britain, it is somebody shouting something nasty on a bus." But for me, such a response is too glib. I think hate crime is certainly a problem, and the far right certainly plays some part in it. There needs to be more research done about the nature of that, but there is some evidence that it does play some part. But at its root, hate crime is much broader than the far right. It stretches way beyond the far right. And arguably, it's really based in ignorance and prejudice. And arguably, the only way we're going to alleviate this problem, because, it's unlikely you'll ever solve it, but the one way to alleviate the problem is to deal with the wider social, cultural, and economic causes that give rise to this ignorance and give rise to this prejudice. Okay, so that's me finished. Okay, thanks.